Hey everyone, how you doing? So, the vine plants in PVZ2. These are interesting to say the very least. I'm not just saying that because they're unique plants, though that does play into it a little bit. I'm more so saying this because, well, they're not exactly discussed a whole lot. I mean, you see daily discussion in Discord servers about the sun producers, or the shrooms, or anything of the sort. But the vines? Yeah, not so much. But with that being said, considering how I did do a mints tier list after I attempted to beat PVZ2 using only mints, I figured I could do a tier list video on the vines too. So this time around, we're going to be ranking all vines in PVZ2. Now, before we get started, just want to get a few things out of the way. First of all, I'm only ranking the level 1 versions of these plants, simply because that makes things easier. Also, after reading the comments on my vine challenge video, I do agree. I think pumpkin should count as a vine, even if it lacks the vine name. So it'll be ranked alongside the other 7 vines in this video. Oh, and finally, if you want to discuss the viability of vines in PVZ2 with other people, then the Floral Federation Discord server might just be for you. Shameless plug. Alright, with that being said, let's jump right into the list, with our bottom picks being... Alright, since there's not that many vines in PVZ2, we're just gonna go ahead and put these two tiers in the same section of the video. Just makes life easier. Now, in regards to what these tiers signify, C tier is for plants that are fine, and B tier is for decent plants. And with that being said, who is our bottom ranker? Well, that would be Blastberry Vine. So let me explain what it is about this vine that I personally don't like. So to start out, let's look at what exactly makes a vine plants good in the first place, which is their compatibility with other plants, and the amount of cover that they can provide, and the buffs too. Now, I'm not saying that Blastberry Vine is a bad choice, but compared to every other vine in the game, this one kinda blows. But why is that? Well, it boils down to his sun cost, the cooldown, and his damage output. He costs 175 sun, which even for a vine is actually pretty pricey. And it's not like he provides a ton of extra support because his berries only do a few damage apiece. And yes, while these can split up and echo across an entire lane, it ultimately doesn't make him a worthwhile plant to use. On top of this, the cooldown for this particular vine feels a lot harsher compared to the other vines. It's not necessarily because it's longer, but it's more so because the plant itself doesn't make up for it in the first place. Now, with that being said, this would be a pretty solid plant to bring it to a level that floods the screen with really weak zombies. But even then, there's better horde sweepers in the vine category, so why bother with Blastberry? It's not even like its plant food is all that good, it's just more damage. Now overall, this plant isn't terrible, it simply can't be, but it's not exactly all that good either. So this is why I believe it's the weakest vine in the game. You simply don't get a whole lot out of it. As for our number 7 pick, we have Pyrevine. This one might seem a little bit weird to put at the bottom of B, but let me explain myself. Pyrevine is a plant that admittedly doesn't have a whole lot going for it, but what it excels in is what makes it a lot better than Blastberry, which is the damage. What it lacks in range, it more than makes up for with its constant spewing of flames. This works out really well in levels that have crowds of zombies. Paired with a Primal Nuts or another wall plant, this is basically constant free damage. On top of this, Pyrevine is also Frostbite Cave's worst nightmare because it can thaw out any plant there. And I'm not gonna lie, I think this works better as a freezing protector than any other fire plant in the game. No joke. The plant food effect here is also solid, it's just Fire Pea. Neat. Oh, and to top things all off, this plant is also cheaper than Blastberry. So yeah, it's better in just about every way. That's kind of sad, but also funny. Anyways, all of these factors and more make it a B tier in my opinion. And to round out this section of the video is our number 6 pick, Gloomvine. Alright, this one's gonna need a pretty big explanation as for why it's this high. So for those unfamiliar with Gloomvine, this plant actually solo boosts a shadow plant. Now that might seem pretty broken, especially with the right set of shadow plants, but there's a catch. The vine itself is very close range. So it feels really backwards to use something like Dustglobber with this plant, because the plant doesn't provide bonus suppression across the lawn. This just puts the plant's viability in a weird place, because now you kind of have to use it further up on the lawn, and that could be a problem for a lot of shadow plants. Now, there are certain benefits to using this plant over the first 2 vines, like the fact that 3 of these in one row can easily kill a conehead on their own, which is actually surprisingly useful if you use that knowledge right. There's also the sun cost of recharge, which are 125 and 5 seconds respectively. Along with those perks, the plant food effect is also really strong too. So this plant does have a lot of positives, but the core issue for me is the viability of it, because besides shadow plants, there's not a whole lot of reasons to use this plant in the first place. So that's why it's at the bottom of B tier, because it's still good, but it has very questionable viability. So those were the bottom picks. It's pretty simple stuff, but now we'll move on to some of the more interesting picks for this video, those being this tier is for the plants that are pretty good and are honestly great picks for most levels and situations. So with that being said, who's at the bottom of this tier? Well, shockingly, it would be Power Vine. No pun intended. I swear. So Power Vine is a very unique vine, and that's because it kind of works like electric current. Yeah, I know, weird, right? So if you're not familiar with what this vine does, it's normally a vine that simply provides long-range damage, but with no pairing, it does a measly 10. For reference, it would take 19 shots to kill one brown coat. Yeesh. But that's without using its main gimmick, and in that case, that would be pairing it up with another power vine in a tile adjacent to it. If you do this, it'll ramp up the amount of shots it fires, now dealing triple the damage it did before. That doesn't exactly make it a whole lot stronger, but it's definitely more usable this way. On top of this, it also has a really interesting plant food effect too. This one actually disables robots if they're within its proximity, which is really neat. But on top of that, it also sprays out a bunch of bullets that deal quite a bit of damage. Now this plant food is a lot weaker without a connection, so it's important that you connect a vine with another one before using this plant food. But still, it's really solid. And that goes for the entire plant as well. It might need to be paired up with others to be useful, but considering what it's capable of, I don't see that as a problem. It's ultimately useful for extra firepower. Alright, now we're halfway through the list. This is where the plants start getting really good, and our fourth pick here is a great example, that being the other A tier plant, Pumpkin. Like I had mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do think this counts as a vine now, after giving it some extra thought. It simply makes sense. I mean, you can place plants inside it. It's fair game. With that being said though, what exactly makes this plant a better vine than the likes of Power, Pyre, and more? Well, that all comes down to the usefulness. Think about it like this. There are two vines in the game that give more protection than an average plant. The one with a higher amount of HP is by far Pumpkin. So you can probably imagine why I'd select this plant as a higher pick than most of the plants on this video so far. This simply comes in handy way more than some extra damage. Also, the recharge for this plant is super generous too. You would think that a wall plant would have a pretty slow recharge, but Pumpkin kind of breaks that rule a little bit, which I think is quite handy. So does Primal, but we'll ignore that. Oh, and finally, the plant food effect here is universally great, not to mention that it gets plant food from reinforcement too. I mean, that's just unfair, come on. But with that being said, there's another tier here that happens to be a lot more unfair than this, which is the top 3 plants. These are the plants that I consider to be must-haves in the vast majority of levels in the game. So with that being said, who's at number 3? Well, that would surprisingly be Shine Vine. So Shine Vine is a really neat plant for a lot of reasons. To start out with, it's a sun producer on its own, which means that technically speaking, you could bring this into a level by itself, and it'll do all the sun producing work for you while you could build a larger defense. Now, it's a little slower for sun producing, but still not a bad start. On top of this, the plant also has a very unique trait when it's in the middle of being eaten. See, most plants simply take it like champs and die while looking fine, but Shine Vine? Nah, this cutie doesn't go down without a fight. It actually stuns the zombie eating it every once in a while, and it'll deal a very small amount of damage. Now, what's interesting about this damage is that it also translates into sun. So yes, this plant acts like a mini sunbeam. Huh, weird. Also, when placed on a sun producer, Shine Vine no longer produces its own sun, and will instead add a bonus amount to the sun producer it's on. As an example, this level 1 Primal Sunflower now produces 100 sun, instead of 75. Neat. Now, for all of those perks and benefits, this plant does have just one problem, and that's ironically its usefulness. And frankly, you don't need it most of the time. If you have a gold bloom, you'll be fine. If you have good plants and a good setup in mind, you'll probably be fine. And hell, even if you're bringing a super expensive setup, you're better off just plant fooding the sun producers instead of bringing this plant. Also, this one doesn't work with Moonflower. Dang. So overall, while Shine Vine is a really neat plant, it also suffers from success by being useful, but not useful enough in the vast majority of situations. That still makes it better than most vines, but it's not enough for me to use it otherwise. Now number 2 is a bit of a different story, and that's because this plant is pretty useful, and that's pea vine. So pea vine might seem like an odd choice to be this high, but hear me out. In case you're not familiar with this plant, it basically buffs appeasement family plants and provides extra firepower on top of that. It can still function just fine on non-appeasement plants, it just won't be as strong. But with that being said, you might have just realized that there's been other family boosting plants in lower tiers. So what makes pea vine stand out amongst the rest? Well, the footage explains itself. And yeah, that's a very noticeable buff. Oh, and it could also be placed on torchwood too. Huh. Yeah, do I need to explain how pea vine is actually pretty good? This plant does not need an explanation, and if you're using an appeasement setup, you'll love this little guy. He's a must pick. And we have just one more plant to cover, and that plant would unsurprisingly be Explodivine. Where do I even begin with this one? Okay, so I guess we'll start with the gimmick. Explodivine does exactly what you think it does. It explodes, but in a technical sense, it can explode in 3 different ways. One way when it's first placed on the lawn, another way when it's consumed fully, and the last way when it's given plant food, which gives it an extra layer of armor on top of exploding. Oh, and that armor is also explosive. Yeah, okay, I think you already understand how this plant could be a little bit broken. But wait, there's more. The explosions themselves each deal 1800 damage, and they also detonate within a 3x3 radius. On top of this, the recharge for this plant is absolutely disgusting for the benefits too. You know how plants like Cherry Bomb have 35 seconds? Well, Explodivine saw that amount, decided that it was too cool to take a long time, and went with 10. PopCap, you are one of the balancing teams of all time, you know that? So, yeah, Explodivine almost has as much HP as a walnut, and it also deals a minimum of 18 damage to any target within a 3x3 radius of itself, and it also has a low cooldown. Well then, I don't think I need to say anything else, do I? This plant is unfair, there's not much else to say. And with that, I'll be ending this video here. Thank you all so much for watching until the end, I really do appreciate it. I know it seems like I'm capitalizing off of the success of my Vine video, and, well, yeah, I am. Let's not beat around the bush here. But of course, that doesn't subject me from criticism on this tier list. So if you disagree with any of these picks, tell me why in the comments. I could simply be mistaken on some entries, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, I want to give a real quick shout out to Gravitry, Identity for Omens, and Wapfa for being $5 supporters of my channel. All of you rock, thank you so much for your support. Now, as for me, I have a certain vine that I'm gonna add to PVZ2, so I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace.